These are the stories of the men and women who answered the call to serve in times of war and peacetime. Their stories are important to tell and record for future generations. This video and the museum exhibit include information from World War II through Afghanistan. The Grundy Center Historical Society is honored to tell and preserve these stories as we continually strive to connect the past to the future. Please enjoy this panel discussion and hear firsthand accounts from our proud veterans.
"70 years ago, I went into the Corps and decided, and they asked me, why did you go in? Why did you volunteer for the service? And for me, it was easy. I guess I felt an obligation. I'd had 4 older brothers that had served, and out of a family of 7 of us. So my dad and mother were told that I would not be drafted. Back in '51, they were drafting people because we had already had 4 members of our family serve in the service. So rather than be called a draft dodger and not go, I enlisted. I fooled them. I went in for 3 years instead of 2, and I went into the Marine Corps.
I graduated from college in 1968. At that time, they were having a hard time finding replacements because of Vietnam, and so they eliminated teaching deferments, and I became 1A. And at that point, I had a cousin that had recently gone into the Marine Corps from Waterloo, and I later decided, well, maybe I would just go ahead and let myself get drafted. And so I ended up for Fort Polk, Louisiana for my basic training with the U.S. Army in August. That's a hard time to be in Louisiana. But anyway, I went on from there to Oklahoma and then eventually to Vietnam, and spent a year in Vietnam and came out in April of 1970.
I grew up in the time of Vietnam, and I got drafted in 1968 and went to the military. I went to Fort Bliss, Texas for my basic training. Then I went to Fort Huachuca for my AIT training, and then ended up being stationed at Fort Hood for about, 30, 60 days, not very long, when I got my orders for Vietnam. In Vietnam, my base camp was Cu Chi, South Vietnam, and most of the time I spent out in the field on a little fire base outside, just off of Highway 1.
I entered the Air Force going through ROTC at the University of Iowa. In my case, it was no question as to whether I would serve in the military. My father and 7 of my uncles had served during World War II, and so it was just kind of expected that that's what you did to serve your country. I went through Air Force ROTC and graduated in 1964 and was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant. I went on in 1965, served at Eglin Air Force Base as a security police officer. Then I went from there to Vietnam in '67 and served through 1968 in Vietnam. Came back from Vietnam to Dover Air Force Base, Delaware, and left the service in 1969.
My experience started right here in Grundy Center, right after high school. Graduated on Friday night. Monday morning, I started working here at the Grundy Register. A year and a half later, in that year and a half, because I was A1, and we did have the draft at that time, I'd seen all the recruiters. The Air Force came, the Navy came, the Army came. I took the Air Force tests, and they told me that I was would qualify as an aviation mechanic. Well, the last fellow to stop and see me was a Marine Corps recruiter, and anyway, after a conversation, he didn't think I was man enough to be a Marine, and that kind of was his hook, because he got me. And so in the Marine Corps I went in November of '65. Didn't take very long. December of '66, Christmas Day actually, I landed in Da Nang, Vietnam, and then from there to Chu Lai, and was there for 2 years.
I was wandering around Sioux City one day, and I was not having luck finding a job, and I passed the Army recruiter. And I went in and I said, "Hi, I'm Colette Goobs at the time." And I said, "I just curious what you have here." He said, "Well, you're in luck because we have a brand new program for women who've had a college degree. And it's great, it pays well, and it's just like being in a college dorm." That part of it was not true. And so I thought, okay, good. So I filled out the paperwork, and there were some obstacles to overcome, but in December 12th, 1972, I became a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army.
I have lived most of my life in Grundy Center, and my father was retired Navy, and so when Dad retired, we moved to Grundy Center. And then I met my husband, we got married, and he was an Army veteran. He was in Vietnam when he was 18 or 19 years old. And Dad was at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed, and in the Korean conflict, Guadalcanal, Korean conflict, and he was aboard ship on aircraft carriers. And anyway, so I am here representing them.
I started off in the Air Force in 1965, and on a 4-year hitch, and that took me. My first base was to training. Basic training was Lackland, and from Lackland I went to a base in Denver, Colorado, which is no longer a base; it's a housing community. And then from there, my first duty station was Okinawa, and so I had an 18-month tour in Okinawa. And while I was in Okinawa, I got a TDY orders, and which stands for temporary duty order, and so that was in Vietnam. So we went back to our training base in Okinawa, and then from Okinawa, my next duty station was in Florida, and I finished up my stateside duty here down in Florida.
Going back to the reason I joined, looking back to other generations, having that constant urge to fill the boots of those that came before me, and that kind of motivates me going forward. Continuing my career in the military is the constant drive to fulfill the duty laid before me by your folks' generation. So
when it came time for me to join, the draft was on, and I decided I'd talk to several different branches of service rather than just be drafted into the Army. And I liked what the Air Force recruiter said, and visited with a cousin of mine that had been in the Air Force, and I decided I'd rather enlist in the Air Force than be drafted, and that's how I decided to get in.
Yeah, I was working out and getting, well, I guess I wasn't getting that old yet, but people were going into the service and filling the quotas all the time, and they kept pushing me back, and I thought, I'll be an old man before they finally invite me. And so I said, I'm going to put my name in there, so next time that there's a need, now I can get going. So that's kind of why I went into service.
In high school, I knew I wanted to do something different. And at the time, I thought I wanted to go become a park ranger. And I started doing research into that, and at the time, you had to have military experience or they wouldn't even talk to you. So I'm like, okay, so I'll go. I don't want to go to the college. I was done with school. That was the last thing I wanted to do, was more schooling. Next thing I knew, I was on my way to the Navy. So I was on delayed entry the whole time in high school, and I knew I was going to be headed 2 weeks after graduation to Orlando, and then go to the other side of the base and become a torpedoman training. So.
So I had a sergeant, and he had asked anybody raise their hands if they were a clerk. And I said, yeah, I was a clerk. And he says, well, you can follow me around a little bit for a week. You're going to get bored doing this jungle training anyway. And after a few days, he found out where I was going, my orders. And he says, you're going to 25th Infantry at On Key. And I says, oh, well. I says, okay. I says, how they doing? Well, that's where you're going. You're going to be a replacement. They're having a lot of problems. I said, well, he says, let me see what I can do. So 2 days later, and I'm shuffling papers for him here and there, he comes back and he says, I think I could get you into Chulai, and where Scott was. And I said, well, that'd be better, because actually I got a cousin out of Waterloo, Iowa, that's in the Marine Corps based in Chulai. And I said, I got a friend from Grundy Center, Mel Vogt, who was working in a mortar unit off a hillside there out of Chulai. So I says, yeah, Chulai sounds good to me.
We went to Korea, where I was assigned to an artillery outfit out by the Freedom Gate Bridge, which is about 1.5 miles from where my barracks were at. I spent the next 2.5 months in a kind of a foxhole deal where we were forward observers.
When I was in basic training, I hurt my back. And so, like the last couple of weeks that everybody was doing training, I was laid up and couldn't do anything. So the lieutenant called me in, and he says, look, I'll give you an option. He says, here's what your MOS is. It's 11 Bravo 10, which is infantry. But he said, with your back, that's not really, not going to really work for you. And he says, you can change it to anything you want. What would you like to do? Or I'll send you back through basic training. Well, I didn't want any part of that. So we changed the MOS. And he goes, here's what you wrote down. I wrote down, because I've always been a smart aleck. So I wrote down door gunner and, I don't know, helicopter pilot, and I don't know, all goofy things. But I also put down cook. And so he goes, look, you got cook on here. You want to be a cook? And I said, sure. I didn't really care. At that time, I didn't know what to do in the military, right? So I ended up being a cook. Well, there were so many people going to Vietnam at that time that it was going to be very, very hard to not end up over there. So then I'm out. I get to Vietnam, and we're flying in, and I was supposed to fly into Long Binh. And Long Binh was under attack, and you could see it. They were attacking the airfield, and stuff was blowing up, and I'm thinking, they're shooting at me, and I haven't even landed yet. So they took us to Cam Ranh Bay, and then we went through the stuff that you were talking about, kind of getting you used to being over there. And then I got assigned with 25 other guys to the 1st to the 5th, 25th Infantry Division in Cu Chi, Vietnam.
Because at the time, women were not allowed in, or were not allowed in the military universities, West Point, the Naval Academy, nor were they in ROTC in college. So this program, by virtue of a college degree and 2 years work experience, you could be commissioned a second lieutenant, and 3 years work experience, you could be commissioned a first lieutenant. January 3rd of 1973, I was in Fort McClellan, Alabama with 90 other women just like me, kind of, sort of. I chose the path of pens and pencils and joined the Adjutant General Corps. So then, after advanced officers training, I went to Fort McClellan, Alabama, and they asked me, do you do math? I said, well, I do, but not very well. Okay, good. With that in mind, you can be the Army Emergency Relief Officer, have a budget of $20,000 a month, take care of it, and you can grant soldiers loans or grants during emergencies. Gotcha. Yes, sir. And so that's what I did for 3 years.
Lyndon Johnson was the president at that time, and our recovery unit was assigned to be in the air 45 minutes before Air Force One touched down, and then he would get off Air Force One, he'd get onto an Army helicopter, and then they would fly him out to Johnson City, where his Texas ranch was, and then we flew cover for him. We carried a foam bottle and everything in case something that would happen to the president. We would be on the spot to put out a fire and make a recovery if need be.
He decided that he was going to enlist, or he was going to, because he knew he was going to be drafted. And so he enlisted in the Marines, and he went down for the physical, and they said he had a heart murmur. So they wouldn't take him. So then, of course, he was drafted, and he went to Des Moines with the letter from Dr. Rose, and saying he had a heart murmur and his rejection from the Marines, and they said, oh, he was fine. And so then he went to Vietnam. He went to Fort Bliss, I believe it was, and then he went to Vietnam from there. And Dad had 3 brothers, and he was the oldest, so he did not have to go in. I guess there was some special kind of dispensation for the oldest son. And but he really wanted to enlist, so Grandpa let him go. So when he was 18, he went. He enlisted, and he got aboard ship right away. He was on the Medusa.
Next thing you know, I was getting closer to my retirement, and we get orders to go to Iraq, and I'm 58 years old, and so I came home, told the wife that we had orders to go, and probably one of the most interesting experiences is to see the look on those young men's face that had primarily entered the National Guard with their thoughts in mind of having some college paid for, and not ever thinking that maybe that day might come that they were going to be faced with either going to serve. And I had a visit with one, if not 2, and I said, you know, this might be hard to swallow right now, but I said, I guarantee you're going to come home a better man than you left. And he and I I still receive a Christmas card from he and his wife and family. And so, you know, it's things like that that really, I made my time worthwhile.
I kind of settled on the National Guard knowing that I had ambitions on the civilian side that I wanted to accomplish, as well as serve my country in the military. So the Army National Guard was the way to go. I officially enlisted in December of 2018 and began the RSP program, the Recruit Sustainment Program. So it's basically you go in and you train once a month before you go to basic training as a preparation for basic training. I left for basic training after graduating high school, shortly after graduating. I was there for 14 weeks at Fort Benning. I enlisted as an 11 Charlie, an infantry mortarman. So I got to go to basic and fire some mortars, and it was a pretty good time meeting a lot of great people, and got to come back right after basic to the civilian world, to the community, and after a few months of being back home, I was assigned to a battalion shortly after getting back, and a few months later we got our official orders for deployment to Qatar.
When I was on active duty, I was a peacetime sailor. There was nothing going, it was like a 9-to-5 job at the time, you know. You went to work every day, you stood duty once every 6 days, and it was a lot of fun. I got my first duty station after Orlando was the Philippines, which I thought my mom was gonna have a heart attack. She was like, how could you go that far? I mean, I enjoyed it over there. I built torpedoes, and we put them on the subs and the ships and the helicopters, so it was a lot of fun, but it was definitely hard. You were there. I mean, I experienced my first typhoon in the Philippines, and that was interesting. But, you know, you got to go out in the community and help them rebuild after stuff like that, or, you know, just, I mean, I lived out in the community for a long time, which was very interesting. So
I spent 18 months over in Germany. I spent the first 9 months as a cook and then I asked the mess sergeant if I couldn't have the night baker's job. And he said, yeah, I think you can handle that. And so then I spent the rest of my time over there in the kitchen. So I didn't begin to see near the action.
On Christmas Day 1966, Da Nang was the busiest airport in the world. It even had more aircraft going in and out of there than O'Hara in Chicago did at the time. It was noisy, it was loud, most everything was jets. Anyway, I asked the fellow there in Da Nang when we checked in where I was going, and he said, you're going to Chu Lai. I said, where's Chu Lai? Oh, he said, it's south of here. Well, he said, you'll learn. I said, what's at Chu Lai? He said, well, mostly right now it's Marine Air Group 12 and Marine Air Group 13. He said, you're assigned to 12. And I said, so what's in 12? He said, A4 Skyhawks. I said, what's an A4 Skyhawk? Honest to God, didn't know what they were. So anyway, I get on this C-130 and the pilot comes on and said, there's only one of you on this C-130 that's going to Chu Lai, and we're dumping you off first. I'm going to taxi when I land, I'm going to taxi to the end of the runway. I'm going to turn around, that back hatch is going to go out. The crew chief's going to throw your bag out, and you're either going to jump or somebody's going to throw you out. That's just basically the way it was. So we're in the air not too terrible long, and this crew chief comes back and he says, forward. And I said, here. And he said, when we land, we're going to do just what the pilot said. And he said, by the way, we're taking small arms fire, so he said, you get your fanny somewhere where you can hide. What? I didn't have a helmet. I didn't have a flak jacket. I didn't have a weapon of any kind. I thought, you're kidding. It happened just like that. He spun around, that back hatch went open, the crew chief threw my bag, and he looked at me, and I said, I'll go. And I just jumped. Of course, I fell, grabbed my seat bag, and hit the sand at the end of the runway and laid behind it, scared to death. I mean, I'm thinking, I'm going to get shot. That was bull. That was bull. That was the kind of stuff that people pulled on each other over there, but that's what it was. It was bull.
He got on the plane, and as we're flying along, the pilot comes on and says, okay, some of you guys are getting ready to get off at On Key. We're going to do a quick stop. And it was a makeshift airstrip where we landed basically on metal runners. And he says, you guys get out, because he says they're under rocket attack right now. And we could hear the rockets motors going off and so forth as he came down. And he did a swing around through the back end open, and those guys that had to stay in On Key were thrown out by two sergeants that were assigned to the plane with their bags and told to low crawl to the first bunker. And the back end went up, and we did a spin around, and we're back up in the air. And the pilot came on the air and said, I'll bet you guys are happy you're not staying at On Key. And I thought to myself, yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
Be quite honest, I was so afraid that I only took my clothes off about every second day to take, to clean up. Because we got hit a lot, for one thing. We got a lot of mortar and rocket attack. And the one time we had 120 rounds of mortar, and we had 21 rockets land in our company area. When they hit that night, I mean, there really wasn't any place to go. I mean, even the bunkers weren't very safe, but they were better. And so I jumped up to head out, and I ran into I don't know what really happened, to be quite honest, and I fell face forward, and I hit the corner of a footlocker and knocked all my teeth out, my upper teeth. And of course, it looked like a lot worse wound, because I had a head wound, and it really bled and everything. And everybody thought that was quite a shock, because you don't really get so much of that when you're in the base camp. And the bad thing with being a cook was that when you got up and you lit the fires in the morning, then the snipers would, ba-zing. he'd get sniper rounds into, because they could see the fire getting up. So we kind of had to come up with a couple of different ways to do that, because that will make you just a little jumpy, just a tad. I had come down, I'd caught malaria, and I was back in the hospital, and I think I was in the hospital for like 17 days, and I think I must have, I think I weighed about 127 pounds when I got out of the hospital, and I was really weak, and they just put me on a chopper, and they fly me out in the middle of nowhere. They dropped me off, and they left me. I was there all by myself for like 5 hours. And when I got off the plane, and when a helicopter lands with the ammo and that kind of thing, and the food, they're gone. I mean, they're down, and they want to get right in the air because they're a setting target. And I said, where are the other guys? Oh, they'll be here in a little bit. 5 hours. I sat there for 5 hours all by myself, and I got to say that was one of the times where there was a little fear creeping through my body. And it was starting to get dark, and then I was really starting to get nervous. But the guys, they finally showed up, and I kind of rambled around with them for about 3 days, and then finally got back to the fire base. And I had to do that every 12 days, go with them, and that was always a little more exciting, than you needed for being just a cook, right, in the military. But it all worked out, and I made my way back, and so I'm here today to help share our stories with the people of Grundy Center, and it's great to be with these guys also.
As soon as the forward air controller in this little plane was spotted by the enemy on the ground, we'd start taking fire. And so it was amazing what the forward air controllers would do. They would kill the engine so that they didn't make any noise, drop down into that area, turn the engine on just before you hit the ground. And of course, when I flew with them, my stomach was up in the clouds as we were going down. Fortunately, the engine came back on, and we flew just a little ways off the surface of the ground. He was calling in the coordinates with one hand, or with his mouth. With one hand, he was throwing a smoke bomb out to mark the area. And if that weren't enough of controlling the aircraft, he had a grenade launcher that he would put out the window and shoot down at the enemy. In the meantime, as the observer, I'm spotting the place so I can take back the coordinates and make sure that we knew where the enemy was located when we directed fire from the base. Here's the story. I said everybody had to fly with the forward air controller. And so I had this one young airman who said, Lieutenant, I don't want to do this. I really don't feel comfortable doing this. I said, you want to work with me? Do you want to work in this coordination center? Everybody else has to do this. And so he said, okay. And he got in the plane. And the plane that he got in crashed on takeoff. It flipped over and crashed on takeoff. I bet I felt about that tall when I was thinking, why did I force him to go and do something he didn't want to do in the first place? But fortunately, both the pilot and my young airman, neither one was seriously hurt and survived. But talk about ironic, I felt pretty low when I was realizing what I'd forced him to do.
After listening to my colleagues here with their stories, mine doesn't compare. My life was never threatened. I never had to jump from a plane with my duffel bag. And I learned when I went on the freedom flight with my husband, I realized my experience was so incredibly different because I'm classified as a Vietnam era vet. In other words, I served during Vietnam, but I was never there. I was never in country. So I I went to Fort McClellan, Alabama for my basic, and that was the first time that there were males there who were training also, and that was the first time that males and females had trained together, not with me personally, but in the same location. And that was interesting. And so I had ladies in my platoon who went to transportation, military police, every branch but infantry. It took 40 years to get women to hold a weapon with standing next to a man. I was from central Iowa, rural Iowa. I was really sheltered. I did not have a clue about how other people lived and what they had or didn't have. And so as I had to interview these soldiers who were applying for financial assistance, most of the reasons for that were 1407, mismanagement of funds. And they all had, the families all had beautiful Bibles. They had top-of-the-line pots and pans. They had jewelry, beautiful jewelry, nice cars, no food. So, and the stories were heart-wrenching. I would go home at night in tears. Finally, I said, you know, Colette, if you're going to survive this, you've got to put ice around your heart. And that's what I had to do, and say, well, I'm sorry your kids are starving, but I can't help you.
One of the hardest things I remember was the first Gulf War. I was stationed in Charleston at the time on a subtender. And a couple of my guys that worked for me, they were gunner's mates. They were young and thought they should be doing something. And so they volunteered and went over to help. And the two young men that came back were so different. And it was really hard seeing the change in them and trying to help them be happy to be alive anymore, or to go back, you know, to the way things were, because it was totally different for them. That was hard. Overall, I didn't find the military I didn't have a lot of things to worry about, you know, because it was a peacetime except for the first Iraq War, and I was in Charleston. So all I did was load up submarines and send them back over. And
was over in Iraq, and I was a sergeant first class at that time. I was in charge of lining up, having the trucks come in for fuel, and so next thing you know, I find myself in a field hospital. Here I had a heat stroke about 13 to 15 months later, to find out that this gentleman was in the field hospital, and he heard the doctor say, well, I'll give him 50-50 chance to survive, and the other one said, I don't give him a chance. In other words, he didn't figure I'd make it till morning. But the good Lord was looking out for me, and here I am today. Out of 650 soldiers that were in our unit, I was the last soldier to come home from there.
The Medusa was at Pearl Harbor, not too far from Pearl City. When it was bombed, it was quite early in the morning, and he was sleeping when it happened on December 7th. And so he was a yeoman. And so he ran up to, at this time he was 19, and he ran up on deck, and he was on what was called the front of the ship, and he was talking on a phone to the gunner. And he remembers the kamikazes coming at them, and they shot down a kamikaze plane, and he told us that they fished the Japanese pilot out of the water, and he said, I swear that must have been the first Japanese prisoner of war during World War II. Anyway, Dad stayed aboard ship from the Medusa, he went to the Navajo. That ship was torpedoed, and he ended up in the water. He said it was just minutes, and the ship was gone. So he threw life jackets in and tried to get some rafts in, and then he just dived in and was in the water for an hour and a half, and then picked up by another ship eventually.
It's our turn to rotate to Japan. We'll be there for 6 to 8 weeks. And if you want to go with us, you're going to have to re-enlist for another tour here in Vietnam. We went back into Vietnam with those same aircraft and those pilots. And it was, we got back just as TETA 68 started. Tough times then. Anyway, it wasn't fun sometimes, but other times it was. And I'm very proud of the fact that I think I represented my community and Iowa very well.
Before we went to Korea, we had to go through cold weather training up in Pickle Meadows, California. It's in northern High Sierra Nevada mountains, and we walk in the door and through the gate, and it says a big sign says, "Many have been cold, but few have frozen. Today's temperature is 20 below zero." Well, we were supposed to spend 3-4 days there, and you probably ain't going to believe this, you Iowa people. I certainly didn't believe it when they told me this, but the last day we were supposed to be there, it snowed not 6 inches, 12 inches, 8 feet. You believe that? 8 foot of snow during the night, and they told us, that it's going to snow hard. And I said, well, I come from Iowa, I know what hard snow is all about. Don't go in your tents, because by morning you're going to be buried. Well, we were. So we just kind of walked around there. But they flew food into us for 3 days, and then we got to come on home.
He said they came in after 5 days, and they had made spaghetti for him. And when the guys came into base camp, ants had gotten into the spaghetti sauce, and the ants were just everywhere. And the guys didn't care. They just stirred in the ants and ate the spaghetti sauce. Apparently there were lots of bugs over there.
The role of the Air Force in Panama was not to protect the canal, but rather to promote goodwill. And so we did a lot of that. We hauled Peace Corps workers out to their location. I remember one time we were going to land with a helicopter, and it blew the thatched roofs off all the little huts that were in that village. And the natives came out with machetes and spears, and the aircraft commander just took back off, and the Peace Corps worker is yelling, "I got to get off here. This is where I'm going to be." And he says, "Nobody's getting off here." And so we went back to base, and 2 days later, the Air Force sent truckloads of men out, and they helped the villagers repair their roads. And after that time, then they took the Peace Corps worker out and let him do his job.
I had a cousin in the Army who was in Vietnam at the same time I was. He was stationed in some other place. I was originally stationed in Da Nang. As you heard, I went to Phan Rang. Lo and behold, he came to Phan Rang as a cook. And so I got to see him. Who would believe, what are the odds of meeting your cousin halfway around the world? But I got to see him, and we would meet sometimes in the evening, and we would have drinks together. In Vietnam, the water was so terrible that when you held it up, you could see the stuff floating in the water. So, and we would drink Kool-Aid. Back in those days, they had little packets of Kool-Aid. You put the Kool-Aid packet in the water, but you had to have something to kill the stuff floating around in the water, so we used vodka. We filled that full of vodka, and that's the way we had our evening sessions together.
I remember when I was in Panama, I was able to call my wife twice in a year and a half because it cost $11 a minute to talk to her on the telephone. And on a soldier's pay, that was pretty hard to do, was to pay that much. But usually I would call collect, and her dad kept looking at his wristwatch, I think. But anyway, we did talk a couple of different times, but we wrote letters every day.
I had a chance to try out for a baseball team, the 11th Marines, and I happened to make that team, so I got to play baseball for a couple of months the summer of '74.
When I went in 1968, I was drafted, and I'd been going to school and wasn't really involved with school very much. I was more involved with drinking beer, playing basketball, chasing girls, and the head of the school there in Marshalltown said, if you keep messing around, you're going to end up in Vietnam. And I thought, that's not going to happen to me. But it did. And so he was right. But I can remember when I got drafted, there were, I think there were 16 of us from Grundy County that got drafted. And we all went uptown here in Grundy up above. And Marilyn Fink was the person that swore us in that day. And she goes, I've got bad news and good news. She goes, the bad news is you're all in the military. And she says, the good news is that one of you gets to be a Marine. So she goes, if anyone would like to volunteer for the Marines, please step forward. There was no motion in that room. None of us wanted to be a Marine. So she goes, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a pencil and a piece of paper, and everybody write their name down on a slip of paper, and we'll have a drawing, and whoever I draw is going to be the Marine. I did like this. I did like this. I saw Ron Shoup. I thought, Ron's a lot better athlete than me. I wrote his name on that piece of paper. And I dropped it right in that hat. Because I figured she's not going to check to see if my name is in there. I did not tell Ron Shoup that for many a year, because I knew he would have killed me. But he did get quite a chuckle out of that.
I knew the fellows that were working in supply. And at one point, one of the guys says, you won't believe this, we just got a shipment in of down-filled sleeping bags into our unit here at WWII. And he says, I don't know, we really didn't need sleeping bags in Vietnam, especially in the summer months and rainy months. And I says, well, I'll tell you what. I says, I'll take 2 of them. He says, what are you going to do with them? I says, I got a college friend that ended up in Anchorage, and he said he needs a sleeping bag up there. So I shipped him a sleeping bag, and I kept the other one for when I had perimeter duty. Would go out to the perimeter at night on the post, and guys used to like to bring goodies to eat and so forth. And when it was time for us to take a little snooze, if you laid down, you'd have rats running across you. So I could zip up into that sleeping bag. It was a mummy bag, and that worked pretty good. So that kind of got me through on my guard duty while I was out there.
We've all spoke about being in Vietnam, but the one thing that we haven't talked about is leaving Vietnam. And I remember when it was time to get on that plane and come home, I got on that plane and I had a quart of Old Granddad in my bag. And that plane, when those wheels lifted off, that plane roared. And I'm not talking about the plane, I'm talking about the guys on that plane. I mean, it was just an eruption because we knew we were all going back to the world and we had survived that crap. And I just kind of sipped my way back to San Francisco.
But when I got out of the service, I came back to Iowa. At that point, nobody wanted to show that you were even in the military. You got the uniform off as fast as you could, and you didn't talk about it.
When Ed got back from Vietnam, he had a job waiting for him at Viking Pump. And so he said the atmosphere was a little hostile at that time to the Vietnam vets, but he just kind of slipped into Grundy Center and didn't really have much of a problem.
When I got out, other than the 2 years of reserve time that I had, I really didn't want to have much to do with the military anymore, simply because of the stigma that was with it. So I did not join the Legion or the AMVETS until not too many years ago.
As far as being a veteran and coming back, I've always talked about how there are harvesters and there are investors in life. You know, the harvesters, they just take and take and take, and they never give anything back to their communities. They don't give anything back to the church. You know, just all kinds of different things. And when I first came back from Vietnam, I was a harvester. And I finally got to a point here about 33, 34 years ago where I realized that I no longer wanted to be a harvester. I wanted to be an investor in life. And I made a huge change in my life, and I started giving back. And one of the first things I did is I joined the veteran groups that had shunned me when I came back from Vietnam.
To continue on with that statement about how people were treated coming home from Vietnam, I can remember coming into to California, flying back into California. You couldn't even get a cab. You know, you had it. You know, you were thumbing a ride for a cab, and hey, they had no time for you. They'd drive by you. That's just how you were treated. But and such a difference after the return from this last war. It's just unbelievable the way people, you know, reached out, and to this day, how people come up to you, thank you for your service. You know, it's just endless, and it's amazing.
It was incredible seeing the support upon returning home by folks around me in the community and stuff. It makes you feel really grateful and happy and proud of what you did. And it helps you get through that feeling of, well, I just wasted a year over there, you know, not doing much or not feeling like you did a lot.
Was discharged from the active Army in 1976, and then from the National Guard. I burned the bridges in 1978. I had become married. I had given birth to my first daughter in April, and I thought, you know, this is all new, and I'm glad to have been a part, to have taken the first step and been in the military as an officer then. But I'm not gonna burn any more paths when I have children. It's not gonna work for me. So I cut the cord in 1978 and raised a family.
Then, when the war was over, he went on recruiting duty. He went to recruiting school and was stationed in Des Moines. And it's, you know, he was from Iowa, so that was wonderful. Met my mom, who had been working who was also from Iowa, and they got married and traveled around the West Coast in the Navy. They were on the Aleutian Islands. I was born in Bremerton on the Naval Hospital, as well as my brother.
I was able to come back and continue helping my community and working a full-time civilian job and integrating back into the civilian life while also taking with me all the lessons that I learned overseas. It was a great opportunity, and I look forward to staying in the Guard and you know, if there's a deployment or another mission that presents itself in the future, I'm more than happy to do what I can. So
I did get injured when I was in the Navy, so I used the VA and they sent me to college, and at the time I thought I wanted to be a teacher, and then I was like, wait a minute, that's too much work. I don't want that much work anymore. But I still work at the school as a custodian now. I was there for a para, but I've spent a lot of time in the school, so. And I think I still bring a lot of that military attitude to the kids. They sort of know, don't mess with Miss Ogden. So
my issue is is that that heat stroke affected me, but probably nobody but my wife knows how. You know, it doesn't appear on the outside, but I definitely have some scars that I carry that are not noticeable when I walk down the street. People say, well, there's nothing wrong with that guy.
It's not easy carrying the official title of veteran. You know, after serving a year overseas active duty, you legally get the title veteran, but not having done nearly as much as your guys' generation, it's a struggle to carry that title with you. But I've come to learn that each new generation has its own challenges, and it's a good thing that the young folks of our generation don't have to go through some of the trying times and stuff that you guys had to go through, but still carrying that torch of respect and freedom that you guys started is a priority for us. So,
if you talk to all these guys, nobody's a hero here. All we did, you know, some of us were drafted, some of us were enlisted. We served. You know, if people ask you, well, why did you go to Vietnam? I have no idea. I got drafted, and I'm an American, and so I went to Vietnam. I don't want to get into all the political controversy of any of that stuff. We just did what we did back then. And it's an honor to have been a veteran, and I'm glad, because it's such a small amount of people in the United States that are actually veterans, that I'm very honored to say that I was a veteran of the United States of America.
Veterans still continue to serve their own and the community in a variety of ways. The lists include volunteer firemen, service clubs, civic board, and churches. Veterans never forget their own and who had their back, and we, the recipients of their service, remember.
Ready, aim, fire! Aim, fire! Aim, fire! Order, hunt! Freeze and hunt! Order, hunt! Let us pray. Receive, O Father, the soul of our Conrad William, and grant him entrance into your heavenly kingdom, where he may know the joy of everlasting life, according to the promise of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Meredith, on behalf of the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, and the Commandant of the Marine Corps, in recognition of William's service to his country, I present to you the flag of a grateful nation.
It has been the Grundy Center Historical Society's privilege to record these memories. This video has been made possible by the generosity of the Mike and Pat Owen family. Though Pat is no longer with us, she left her heartfelt mark on this community. These are the stories from Grundy Center veterans. To learn other stories and see artifacts and displays, please visit the Grundy Center Historical Museum at 610 7th Street. Come enjoy this exhibit until November 27th, 2021.